A generous man named Samuel helps a stranded woman named Emily in a snowstorm, an act of kindness he never expected to lead to anything more. But when Samuel's past resurfaces unexpectedly, his quiet life is turned upside down. As Emily's involvement grows, Samuel finds himself caught in a web of danger that he thought he had left behind. What was it about this seemingly simple gesture of help that brought Samuel's hidden fears to the surface? And how did Emily's role in this unexpected turn of events change their lives forever? Let's find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this tale of courage and redemption, don't forget to subscribe. Snowflakes fell silently, covering the small town in a thick, white blanket. The quiet streets of Willow Creek, nestled in the heart of a dense forest, were almost deserted as the storm raged on. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, chilling you from the inside out. Streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the empty roads. The air was crisp, biting, and the town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the storm to pass. At the edge of town, in a modest, well-worn house, lived a man named Samuel. Samuel was in his late 30s, a middle-aged black man with a strong build and a quiet demeanor. He worked as a mechanic at the local auto shop, fixing cars with the precision and care of someone who'd spent years perfecting his craft. Though he was respected by his neighbors, Samuel wasn't the type to engage in idle chatter or attend community gatherings. He preferred solitude, his life marked by a certain routine that kept him content. Samuel's past was a mystery to most. He carried an air of quiet reflection, as if always lost in thought. His dark eyes held stories untold, and a tattoo on his forearm hinted at a life much different from the one he led now. The tattoo, a simple design of an anchor entwined with barbed wire, was something he rarely spoke about. When asked, he'd merely smile, a ghost of a smile, and change the subject. In his home, a small wooden box, tucked away in the back of his closet, held old letters and mementos from a time he'd rather forget. Samuel never opened the box, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away either. This particular evening, the snowstorm had worsened by the hour. The wind howled through the trees, and the snowdrifts piled high against houses and cars. Samuel finished his workday later than usual, having stayed behind to repair an old pickup truck for a customer who needed it urgently. He bundled up in his thick, worn coat, pulled his knit cap over his ears, and headed out to his truck. The roads were treacherous, slick with ice and snow. Samuel drove carefully, his truck's headlights barely cutting through the swirling snow. As he navigated the winding road back to his house, his thoughts were as quiet as the town itself. He liked driving in the snow. It gave him time to think, to be alone with his memories. But tonight, something felt different, as if the storm was carrying more than just snow and wind. As Samuel turned onto a narrow, tree-lined road, he spotted a car up ahead, its hazard lights flashing weakly through the snow. The car was stuck, its tires spinning uselessly in the snowbank that had formed at the side of the road. Samuel slowed his truck, coming to a stop a few feet away from the stranded vehicle. The storm was fierce, and the driver was clearly in trouble. Samuel stepped out of his truck, the cold immediately biting at his exposed skin. He approached the car cautiously, his boots crunching in the snow. As he drew closer, he could see a figure inside, moving frantically. The driver's side door opened, and a young woman stepped out, nearly slipping on the icy ground. "Hey, are you okay?" Samuel called out, his voice carrying over the howling wind. The woman looked up, her face pale and frightened. I'm stuck," she stammered, her breath visible in the freezing air. "I've been trying to dig the car out, but it's not working. I don't know what to do." Samuel took in the scene. A small shovel lay discarded in the snow, and the woman's attempts to free the car had only made things worse. The car's tires were deeply embedded in the snowbank, and the vehicle wasn't going anywhere without help. "Don't worry, I'll help you out," Samuel said calmly. "Just stay inside the car where it's warmer. I'll take care of it." The woman hesitated for a moment, clearly nervous, but the cold was too much, and she nodded gratefully before retreating into the car. Samuel went back to his truck, retrieving a sturdy shovel and a few tools he kept for emergencies. The snow whipped around him as he began to dig, each movement precise and practiced. As he worked, Samuel glanced at the woman through the car window. She looked like she was in her late 20s with long, dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She was wearing a thick coat, but it was clear she wasn't dressed for this kind of weather. Her hands shook slightly as she watched him, and Samuel could see the anxiety in her eyes. It took nearly half an hour, but finally, Samuel managed to clear enough snow to free the car. He signaled for the woman to try the engine, and with a bit of coaxing, the car's tires found traction and rolled out of the snowbank. Samuel waved her down the road a bit before the car came to a stop again, this time safely out of the deep snow. The woman stepped out of the car once more, this time with a mixture of relief and gratitude on her face. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice shaky but sincere. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped. I'm Emily, by the way." "Samuel," he replied with a nod. "I'm glad I could help." Emily offered a small, nervous smile, clearly still a bit on edge. "I'm new in town," she explained, almost as if to fill the silence. "Just moved here a few weeks ago for a job. I didn't realize the weather could get this bad." Samuel chuckled softly, his breath forming small clouds in the air. "Willow Creek winters are no joke," he said. "It takes some getting used to." Emily nodded, rubbing her gloved hands together. "I guess I learned that the hard way," she said, glancing at the car. "Thank you again." "Really?" "You're welcome," Samuel replied. "Just be careful out there. The roads can be dangerous in a storm like this." Emily reached in her coat pocket and pulled out a small wallet. "Let me pay you for your trouble," she offered, opening it to reveal a few bills. Samuel shook his head firmly. "No need for that," he said. "I was just doing what anyone would." Emily looked surprised, her hand freezing mid-motion. "But it's okay," Samuel interrupted gently. "You needed help, and I was here. That's all there is to it." Emily hesitated for a moment before slowly lowering her hand. "Well, thank you, Samuel. I appreciate it more than you know." Samuel nodded again, then turned to head back to his truck. The storm was still raging, and he needed to get home before the roads became completely impassable. As he walked away, Emily called out to him one last time. "If you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to ask," she said earnestly. "I owe you one." Samuel paused, looking back at her. "Take care, Emily," he said with a slight smile before climbing into his truck and driving off. As he drove, the events of the evening played over in Samuel's mind. He hadn't expected to encounter anyone on the road, let alone end up helping someone. But as he thought about it, a sense of unease settled over him. It wasn't the act of helping that bothered him. He'd done it instinctively, without a second thought. No, it was something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The storm outside was relentless, but it was the storm inside Samuel that concerned him more. When Samuel finally reached his house, he parked the truck and sat for a moment in the silence, the engine ticking as it cooled. He rubbed his hands together, feeling the warmth slowly return to his fingers. His thoughts drifted back to the tattoo on his arm, hidden beneath layers of clothing. It had been years since he'd last thought about the meaning behind it, and even longer since anyone had asked him about it. But tonight, as the snow piled up around his home, those old memories seemed closer than ever. Samuel shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. He was safe here, far from the life he'd left behind. Willow Creek was his sanctuary, a place where he could live quietly, away from the shadows of his past. But as he climbed out of the truck and made his way inside, he couldn't help but feel that the past had a way of creeping up on you when you least expected it. The house was cold, the heat having been off while Samuel was out. He quickly stoked the fire in the small wood-burning stove in his living room, the flames casting a warm, flickering light across the room. As the fire crackled to life, Samuel sat down in his favorite chair, a worn recliner that had seen better days. He leaned back, closing his eyes, trying to shake off the lingering unease. In the corner of the room, the small wooden box sat on a shelf, almost out of sight. It was an unassuming box, easily overlooked by anyone who didn't know its significance. But to Samuel, it was a reminder of a life he'd worked hard to forget. Inside were letters, photographs, and a few trinkets that held the weight of years gone by. Samuel hadn't opened the box in a long time, but tonight he felt its presence more keenly than usual. He opened his eyes, staring at the fire as the warmth slowly filled the room. The snow outside continued to fall, piling up against the windows and doors, sealing the world in a cocoon of white. Samuel listened to the wind howling outside, the sound both comforting and unnerving at the same time. For now, all was quiet. But deep down, Samuel knew that peace was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the slightest disturbance. And tonight, as the storm raged on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The sun struggled to break through the heavy clouds as morning dawned in Willow Creek. The storm had subsided, leaving behind a thick blanket of snow that covered every surface, making the town look like a scene from a snow globe. The roads were still treacherous, but the sky was a dull gray, hinting at more snow to come. Samuel had been up early, as usual, already busy in his garage by the time the rest of the town was waking up. The warmth of the small heater in the corner kept the chill at bay as he worked on an old sedan that needed a new alternator. The steady rhythm of his tools was soothing, a welcome distraction from the thoughts that had plagued him all night. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him after helping Emily. Something about the encounter had stirred memories he'd long tried to bury, and he didn't like it. He was so engrossed in his work that he didn't hear the soft knock on the garage door at first. It wasn't until the knock came again, a little louder this time, that he straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see Emily standing there, her cheeks flushed from the cold, holding a pie dish covered in foil. "Good morning," she said, a little breathless from the cold. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Samuel blinked in surprise, not expecting to see her again so soon. "Morning, Emily," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "What brings you here?" "I just wanted to say thank you again for helping me yesterday," she replied, offering him the pie with a shy smile. "I made this for you." Samuel hesitated for a moment, then took the dish from her. "You didn't have to do that," he said, though he was touched by the gesture. "I wanted to," Emily insisted. "It's the least I could do." "Thank you," Samuel said sincerely, setting the pie down on a nearby workbench. "Would you like to come in for a bit? It's warmer in here." Emily nodded gratefully, stepping further into the garage. The warmth was a welcome relief from the biting cold outside. She looked around the space, taking in the organized chaos of tools and car parts scattered about. "This is where you work?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity. "Yeah," Samuel replied, glancing around the garage. "It's not much, but it gets the job done." "I think it's great," Emily said, smiling at him. "You must be really good at what you do." Samuel shrugged modestly. "I've been doing it for a long time. It's just what I know." There was a brief silence as Emily shifted on her feet, still holding her hands close to her body to keep warm. Samuel noticed and gestured to an old stool near the heater. "You can sit if you'd like," he offered. Emily nodded and took a seat, warming her hands over the small heater. "It's funny," she said after a moment. "I've been here for a few weeks, but I haven't really met many people yet. I guess I'm still getting used to the town." "Willow Creek can be quiet, especially in the winter," Samuel replied. "But the people are good. You'll settle in soon enough." Emily smiled, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "I hope so. It's just different from what I'm used to. But I'm trying." Samuel nodded, understanding. "Change can be hard, but you'll find your way." They lapsed into a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled with words. Samuel went back to his work, and Emily watched him, fascinated by the ease with which he handled the tools and parts. It was clear he knew exactly what he was doing, every movement precise and confident. After a while, Samuel glanced at her, noticing her quiet observation. "Do you know much about cars?" he asked. "Not really," Emily admitted with a sheepish grin. "I'm afraid I'm pretty clueless when it comes to anything under the hood." Samuel chuckled softly. "Well, if you ever need help with your car again, you know where to find me." Emily's smile widened. "I'll definitely keep that in mind." As the morning wore on, the initial nervousness Emily had felt around Samuel began to fade. There was something comforting about his presence, a steadiness that made her feel at ease. She found herself asking more questions, curious about his life in Willow Creek, how long he'd lived there, what he liked about the town. Samuel answered her questions politely, but didn't offer much detail, keeping the conversation light and focused on the present. Yet, despite his guarded responses, there was something about Samuel that intrigued Emily. She could sense there was more to him than met the eye, a depth that he kept hidden beneath his calm exterior. But she didn't push, sensing that whatever he was holding back, he wasn't ready to share. As noon approached, Emily realized she'd been in the garage for much longer than she'd intended. "I should probably get going," she said, standing up and brushing off her coat. "I don't want to keep you from your work." "It's no trouble," Samuel replied, setting down his tools. "Thank you for the pie. It was nice of you to stop by." Emily smiled, genuinely pleased. "I'm glad I did. And thank you again, Samuel. I hope we can talk more sometime." "Anytime," Samuel said, offering a small nod. With that, Emily left the garage, stepping out into the cold once more. As she walked back to her car, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of accomplishment. She'd been nervous about approaching Samuel, not sure if he'd welcome her gesture, but it had gone better than she'd hoped. Maybe, she thought, this could be the start of a new friendship. Samuel watched her drive away from the garage door, his mind turning over the events of the morning. He wasn't used to visitors, let alone someone like Emily, who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know him. It was a strange feeling, but not entirely unwelcome. There was a part of him that enjoyed the brief connection, the break from his usual solitude. But as the day wore on, Samuel couldn't shake the lingering unease that had settled in his chest. It wasn't just the memories from the night before that troubled him. It was something more immediate, more pressing. He found himself glancing out the garage windows more often than usual, his eyes scanning the street for anything out of place. By late afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Samuel noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Parked across the street, partially obscured by a large snowbank, was a car he didn't recognize. It wasn't one of the neighbors' cars, and it hadn't been there earlier in the day. It sat there, engine off, with no sign of anyone inside. Samuel frowned, his mind racing. It could be nothing, just someone visiting a neighbor or waiting for someone. But combined with the unease he'd been feeling, it set off alarm bells in his head. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that someone was keeping tabs on him. Trying to appear casual, Samuel walked out of the garage and into the cold, glancing at the car as he made his way to the mailbox at the end of his driveway. He took his time, pretending to check the mail while keeping an eye on the car. But no one emerged, and the car remained eerily still. When he returned to the garage, Samuel couldn't concentrate on his work. His thoughts kept drifting back to the car, and to the nagging suspicion that his past was finally catching up to him. He hadn't had to worry about that in years. He'd been careful, kept to himself, and made sure no one from his old life could find him. But now, he wasn't so sure. That evening, as he sat alone in his small house, Samuel's anxiety grew. He double-checked the locks on his doors and windows, something he hadn't felt the need to do in a long time. The house felt too quiet, the silence amplifying his unease. He glanced at the wooden box on the shelf, its presence more ominous than ever. He knew what was inside, and he knew that if his past was truly catching up with him, it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The next day, Emily returned to the garage, this time with a thermos of hot coffee and a couple of sandwiches. She'd noticed the slight tension in Samuel's demeanor the day before and wanted to check in on him. Samuel was surprised to see her again so soon, but he appreciated the gesture. "Morning, Samuel," Emily greeted him with a smile. "I brought you something to keep you warm." "Morning, Emily," Samuel replied, a little more guarded than the day before. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," she said, handing him the thermos. "I thought you might appreciate it while you're working." Samuel accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, taking a sip as the warmth spread through his body. "I appreciate it," he said sincerely. "How are you today?" "I'm good," Emily replied, though she hesitated before continuing. "But I noticed you seemed a little off yesterday. Is everything all right?" Samuel glanced at her, his guard going up immediately. He hadn't realized he'd been that obvious. "I'm fine," he said quickly, trying to sound casual. "Just a lot on my mind, that's all." Emily looked at him with concern, sensing there was more to it. "If there's anything you need to talk about, I'm here," she offered gently. Samuel shook his head. not wanting to burden her with his worries. "It's nothing really, just some old memories." Emily didn't press the issue, but she could tell there was something deeper bothering him. She decided to change the subject, hoping to lighten the mood. "So, have you lived in Willow Creek your whole life?" Samuel was grateful for the shift in conversation. "No," he replied, his voice a little softer. "I moved here about 10 years ago." "What made you choose Willow Creek?" Emily asked, genuinely curious. "It was quiet," Samuel said simply. "I needed a fresh start, and this seemed like the right place." Emily nodded, understanding. Sometimes a fresh start is exactly what we need. They continued to talk as Samuel worked, and slowly, the tension in the air began to ease. Emily's presence was a welcome distraction, and for a while, Samuel was able to push his worries to the back of his mind. They chatted about mundane things, the weather, the town, Emily's job, and it felt almost normal, like two friends catching up. But even as they talked, Samuel couldn't fully shake the feeling of being watched. He kept glancing toward the garage windows, half expecting to see that mysterious car still parked outside. But it was gone, leaving him to wonder if he'd imagined the whole thing. As the days went on, Emily continued to visit Samuel, bringing him small gifts of food and coffee as a way to show her appreciation. Their conversations became more frequent, and with each visit, Emily grew more comfortable around him. She started to ask more questions about his life, but Samuel remained cautious, careful not to reveal too much about his past. He enjoyed Emily's company, though, and found himself looking forward to her visits. It was a strange feeling, this connection with someone new, but it was also a reminder of the life he'd left behind, a life filled with connections he'd had to sever to keep himself safe. Then, one evening, as Samuel was locking up the garage, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. Tucked under the windshield wiper of his truck was an envelope, sealed and unmarked. He hadn't seen anyone approach the garage all day, and yet there it was. Samuel's heart raced as he snatched the envelope from the windshield, quickly glancing around to see if anyone was watching. The street was empty, the only sound the soft crunch of snow under his boots. He didn't open the envelope until he was inside the garage, where he tore it open with trembling hands. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message written in bold, black letters. "We know where you are." Samuel stared at the message, his mind racing. Someone had found him. After all these years, after all the precautions he'd taken, someone from his past had tracked him down. And they were letting him know that they were watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Panic surged through him, and for a moment, all he could think about was running, packing up what little he had and disappearing again, just like he had before. But he knew that wouldn't solve anything. If they'd found him once, they could find him again. And this time, he wasn't sure he had the strength to keep running. Samuel crumpled the note in his fist, a wave of fear and anger washing over him. He knew he couldn't ignore this. He had to figure out who was behind this and what they wanted, and he had to do it before they got to him first. The next day, Samuel was more cautious than ever. He avoided leaving the garage unless absolutely necessary, keeping a close eye on his surroundings. He noticed a few unfamiliar faces around town. A man sitting in a parked car near the grocery store, a woman who seemed to be lingering a little too long outside his house. But he couldn't be sure if they were connected to the note or if he was just being paranoid. Emily noticed the change in him immediately when she visited the garage that afternoon. She brought him a hot cup of tea, but Samuel barely touched it, his mind too preoccupied with the threat looming over him. "Samuel, are you sure everything's okay?" Emily asked, her voice full of concern. "You don't seem like yourself." Samuel forced a smile, trying to put her at ease. "I'm fine, Emily. Just a lot on my mind." Emily frowned, not convinced. "Is there something going on? You can talk to me, you know." Samuel hesitated, torn between wanting to keep her safe and the overwhelming urge to confide in someone. He'd been carrying this burden alone for so long, and the weight of it was starting to wear him down. But he couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth. Not yet. "It's nothing you need to worry about," Samuel said finally, his voice firm. "I'm just dealing with some personal stuff. It'll pass." Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay," she said softly. "But if you ever need to talk, I'm here." "Thanks, Emily," Samuel replied, genuinely grateful for her kindness. As Emily left the garage, Samuel watched her go with a heavy heart. He knew he couldn't keep her in the dark forever, but the thought of dragging her into his mess was too much to bear. He'd brought this on himself, and he was determined to deal with it alone. But the more he tried to push Emily away, the more she seemed to care. And as the days went on, their friendship continued to grow, despite Samuel's attempts to keep his distance. He found himself opening up to her in small ways, sharing bits and pieces of his life that he'd never told anyone in Willow Creek. And with each conversation, Emily's curiosity about him deepened. Samuel knew he was playing a dangerous game. The closer Emily got, the harder it would be to protect her from the darkness of his past. But there was something about her, a warmth, a genuine kindness, that made it impossible for him to shut her out completely. And so, he continued to let her in, even as the shadows of his past began to close in around him. The strange occurrences became more frequent. The mysterious car, the unmarked letters, the feeling of being watched. Each day, the tension grew, and Samuel found himself questioning every decision he'd made since the day he'd helped Emily out of that snowbank. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control, that no matter what he did, the past was going to catch up with him. And when it did, he feared it would destroy everything he'd worked so hard to build. But for now, all he could do was wait. Wait for the storm to break, and hope that when it did, he'd be strong enough to face whatever was coming his way. The day had been long, and Samuel, feeling every bit of its weight, was ready to close up the garage and head home. The winter evening had settled in, with the sun long gone, leaving the town of Willow Creek bathed in a dim, bluish twilight. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way to the garage door, the cold air biting at his skin. As he reached for the door handle, a faint noise caught his attention. Two shadows emerged from the darkness, moving slowly but deliberately toward him. Samuel's heart skipped a beat as the figures stepped into the light cast by the single bulb above the garage entrance. His worst fears materialized before his eyes. It was them. They were older now, just like him, but Samuel recognized them instantly. The cold, hard faces of men he had hoped never to see again. John and Rick, once his closest allies in a life he had buried deep in the past, now stood before him, their expressions a mix of anger and dark intent. "Long time, no see, Samuel," John said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he leaned against the garage wall, casually pulling a cigarette from his coat pocket. Rick, the more brutish of the two, cracked his knuckles, his eyes scanning the garage as if appraising Samuel's new life. "You've done well for yourself," Rick said, his tone mocking. "But we all knew you'd end up somewhere like this, hiding, pretending to be something you're not." Samuel's stomach churned. He had known this day might come, but he had never expected it to be like this. So sudden, so terrifyingly real. He swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. John took a drag from his cigarette, blowing out a thin stream of smoke. "We need your help, Samuel. Just one last job. You know the drill, quick, clean, and nobody gets hurt." Samuel's blood ran cold. He had spent years trying to forget the life he once led, the crimes, the danger, the guilt. The very thought of returning to that world made his skin crawl. "I'm done with that life," he said firmly. "I'm not helping you." Rick's expression darkened, and he took a menacing step closer. "You don't have a choice," he growled. "You think you can just walk away? You owe us, Samuel. You've been living the good life while we've been dealing with the consequences of your actions." John flicked his cigarette onto the ground, crushing it beneath his boot. "It's simple, really," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "You help us, or we expose you. The police here think you're just some quiet mechanic. Imagine how they'd react if they knew who you really are, what you've done." Samuel's mind raced, weighing his options. He knew these men were serious. They wouldn't hesitate to destroy the life he had built, and worse, they could drag Emily into this mess. He couldn't let that happen. But he also couldn't go back to that life, a life filled with violence and crime. He had worked too hard to leave it behind. As he struggled with his thoughts, a soft sound caught his attention. Footsteps, almost inaudible, but enough to make him tense. He turned his head slightly, his eyes scanning the shadows beyond the garage. There, half hidden behind a stack of old tires, was Emily. Her eyes were wide with fear and confusion as she watched the scene unfold before her. She must have heard enough to know that Samuel was in trouble, but not enough to fully understand what was happening. Samuel's heart sank. He had to protect her, but he couldn't let her get caught up in this nightmare. For a moment, their eyes met, and he saw the question in her gaze. "Who are you, really?" "Emily," he thought, "please stay hidden." He couldn't afford to have her involved in this. Not now. Not ever. John's voice pulled him back to the present. "Well, Samuel, what's it going to be? Are you in, or do we have to make things difficult for you?" Samuel clenched his fists, trying to keep his emotions in check. He was trapped, cornered by the life he thought he had left behind. If he agreed to their demands, he would lose everything he had worked for. But if he refused, they would destroy him, and possibly Emily too. He had no choice. "Fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it, but this is the last time. After this, we're done." A cold smile spread across John's face. "That's what I like to hear. We'll be in touch with the details." Rick smirked, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Good decision, Samuel. For your sake, I hope you don't regret it." The two men turned and walked away, their figures disappearing into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. Samuel stood frozen, the weight of his decision crushing him. He had just condemned himself to the very life he had fought so hard to escape. As the sound of their footsteps faded, Samuel let out a shaky breath. The night was silent again, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. He knew this was only the beginning. The storm was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Emily stepped out from her hiding place, her face pale, her eyes full of questions. Samuel braced himself for what was to come, knowing he couldn't keep the truth from her any longer. Emily approached Samuel slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen him like this, so tense, so afraid. It didn't match the image of the quiet, reserved man she had come to know over the past few weeks. "Samuel," she began, her voice trembling. "What was that about? Who were those men?" Samuel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He could feel the walls closing in on him, the lies he had built his life on starting to crumble. There was no point in hiding anymore. "Emily," he said softly, "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you from the beginning." Emily listened intently, her mind racing as she tried to piece together the fragments of what she had overheard. She could see the anguish in Samuel's eyes, the fear that seemed to grip him like a vice. "Those men, they're from my past," Samuel began, his voice thick with regret. "A past I've spent years trying to run away from. My real name isn't Samuel. It's Marcus. Marcus Taylor." Emily's eyes widened in shock. "Marcus? But why? Why would you change your name? What did you do?" "Marcus." Samuel looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I wasn't always the person you know now. I was part of a criminal group, a gang, really. We did things I'm not proud of. I thought I could walk away, start over, but it turns out you can't escape your past." Emily's heart ached at the pain in his voice. She had sensed there was more to Samuel, Marcus, than he had let on, but she never could have imagined this. "But you left that life behind," she said, trying to understand. "You're not that person anymore." Marcus shook his head, his expression filled with despair. "It doesn't matter. They've found me, and they want me to do one last job for them. If I don't, they'll expose me to the police, ruin everything I've built here. And they won't stop there. They could come after you, too." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The thought of being caught up in something so dangerous was terrifying, but what scared her more was the idea of losing Marcus, the man she had come to care for, the man who had shown her kindness and friendship when she needed it most. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus was silent for a long moment, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't go back to that life, but he also knew the consequences of refusing the men's demands. It wasn't just his life on the line anymore. It was Emily's, too. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But I can't let them hurt you, Emily. I'd rather face the consequences myself than see you get caught in the crossfire." Emily's eyes filled with tears. She had never felt so conflicted, so helpless. She wanted to help Marcus, to protect him from whatever was coming, but she didn't know how. Maybe we can go to the police, she suggested, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't a real solution. Marcus shook his head again. I can't risk it. If they find out I've gone to the police, they'll come after you. And they won't stop until they've made their point. Emily felt her heart sink. It was clear Marcus was trapped, and there seemed to be no way out. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. You're not alone in this, she said, her voice full of determination. We'll find a way through this. Together. Marcus looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. He had spent so many years keeping people at arm's length, afraid to let anyone get too close. But now, with Emily standing by his side, he realized just how much he had to lose. Thank you, Emily, he said softly. But I don't want you to get hurt because of me. If anything happens, I need you to promise me you'll stay safe. No matter what. Emily shook her head, her resolve firm. I'm not going anywhere, Marcus. I care about you, and I'm not going to let you face this alone. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent so long running from his past, trying to build a new life, but now it was all crashing down around him. The only thing he had left was Emily's unwavering support, and that meant more to him than anything else in the world. All right, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We'll figure this out, but I need you to be careful. These men, they're dangerous. They won't hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in their way. Emily nodded, her eyes full of determination. I'll be careful, she promised. But we're in this together, Marcus. No matter what. As they stood there in the dimly lit garage, the weight of the situation pressing down on them, Marcus couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. He didn't know what the future held, but with Emily by his side, he knew he had a fighting chance. The threat had emerged, and the stakes had never been higher. But in that moment, Marcus knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. He would find a way to protect Emily and the life they had started to build together. And no matter what it took, he would keep his promise to her. The night was long, and the road ahead was uncertain, but Marcus was ready to face whatever came his way. Because now he had something worth fighting for. The night was quiet, but Marcus's mind raced with thoughts of what needed to be done. After his conversation with Emily, the fear and uncertainty that had clouded his mind began to clear. He couldn't keep running. The time had come to face his past and put an end to it once and for all. Marcus sat at the small kitchen table in his modest home, staring at the phone in his hand. He knew what he had to do, but it didn't make it any easier. Emily sat across from him, her face set in determination. You don't have to do this alone, Emily said, her voice steady. We're in this together, remember? Marcus shook his head. Emily, this is dangerous. These men, they're not like anyone you've ever dealt with. I can't let you get involved. Emily leaned forward, placing her hand on his. You can't do this alone, Marcus. You know the town, but I know the people. I can help. Let me help. Marcus hesitated. The idea of putting Emily in harm's way terrified him, but he also knew she was right. She had been by his side through everything, and without her, he wouldn't have come this far. All right, Marcus said finally, but we have to be smart about this. We need a plan. Emily nodded, her eyes never leaving his. What do you have in mind? Marcus leaned back in his chair, thinking through every detail. We're going to set a trap. I know how these men think, how they operate. We can use that against them. Emily listened intently as Marcus laid out the plan. He would lure John and Rick to an isolated part of town, an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts. It was a place where no one would hear or see what was happening, perfect for the confrontation he was planning. They'll expect me to show up alone, unprepared, Marcus explained. But I'm going to have the upper hand. I'll disable their car, trap them inside the warehouse, and record their confession. Once we have that, we can take it to the police. Emily considered the plan, nodding as Marcus spoke. It could work, she said. But how will you disable their car? Marcus smiled grimly. I've spent years working on cars. I know how to sabotage one without them realizing it until it's too late. Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for Marcus. Despite the fear he must be feeling, he was calm, collected, and focused on the task at hand. It was clear that he had been through a lot in his life, but instead of letting it break him, it had made him stronger. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, his tone serious. "I don't want you anywhere near the warehouse when this goes down. It's too dangerous." Emily shook her head. "I can't just sit back and do nothing. I need to be there." "Emily, please," Marcus pleaded. "If something goes wrong, I need to know that you're safe. I can't do this if I'm worried about you getting hurt." Emily saw the desperation in his eyes and reluctantly agreed. "All right, but I'll be close by. If anything goes wrong, I'll call the police." Marcus nodded, relieved. "Thank you." They spent the next few hours going over the plan in detail, making sure every aspect was covered. Emily used her knowledge of the town and its people to gather information, learning about the warehouse and the best way to approach it without drawing attention. Meanwhile, Marcus prepared the tools he would need to disable the men's car and set up the recording device. As the night wore on, the weight of what they were about to do settled over them. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a battle for Marcus's future, and he was determined to come out on top. The next night, Marcus stood outside the old warehouse, the cold winter air biting at his skin. The building loomed before him, its dark windows staring back like empty eyes. It was the perfect place for what he had planned, isolated, forgotten, and far from prying eyes. He glanced down at his watch, noting the time. John and Rick would be here soon. He had left them a message earlier that day, telling them where to meet him. They had taken the bait without hesitation, confident that they had the upper hand. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and preparing for. He had to stay focused, stay sharp. He heard the sound of a car approaching and quickly ducked behind a stack of crates near the entrance. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the front of the warehouse as it came to a stop. Marcus watched as John and Rick stepped out, their figures silhouetted against the light. "Where is he?" Rick muttered, glancing around. "He'll be here," John replied confidently. "He knows what's at stake." They began to walk toward the warehouse, and Marcus knew it was time to make his move. He moved silently, using the shadows to his advantage as he approached their car. With quick, practiced hands, he reached beneath the hood and disconnected a crucial component, rendering the car useless. As he finished, he heard the sound of the warehouse door creaking open. He turned to see John and Rick stepping inside, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. Marcus followed them, his heart racing as he entered the building. The warehouse was dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through the broken windows. Marcus could hear the men's voices as they called out for him, their tone growing more impatient with each passing second. "Come on, Samuel," Rick shouted. "We don't have all night." Marcus took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He stepped out of the shadows, his figure illuminated by the pale moonlight. "I'm here," he said, his voice echoing through the warehouse. John and Rick turned to face him, their expressions a mix of surprise and anger. "Took you long enough," John sneered. "We were starting to think you'd backed out." "I'm not backing out," Marcus replied calmly. "But I'm not going to do what you want either." Rick's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Marcus took a step closer, his gaze steady. "I'm not helping you. Not now, not ever. This ends tonight." John's face twisted with rage. "You think you could just walk away? We own you, Samuel. You don't get to decide when this ends." Marcus shook his head. "You don't own me. Not anymore." Before they could react, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recording device. He held it up, letting the men see the red light blinking on top. "I've been recording this entire conversation," Marcus said, his voice cold. "Every threat, every demand, it's all on tape. The police will have everything they need to put you away for a long time." John's eyes widened in shock, and he took a step back. You set us up?" Rick's face turned red with anger, and he lunged at Marcus. But Marcus was ready. He sidestepped the attack, using Rick's momentum against him to send him crashing into a stack of crates. John pulled out a knife, his hand shaking with rage. "You're dead, Samuel. You hear me? Dead." But Marcus didn't flinch. He had spent years running, hiding from these men and the life they represented. But not anymore. He was done being afraid. "You're not going to hurt anyone," Marcus said, his voice steady. It's over. Before John could make another move, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder by the second. Emily had kept her promise. She had called the police the moment she knew things were going south. John's face paled, and he glanced around, realizing they were trapped. The sirens grew louder, and the red and blue lights of the police cars illuminated the warehouse as they pulled up outside. Marcus watched as John dropped the knife, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Rick, still dazed from his fall, struggled to stand, but it was no use. The police were here, and there was nowhere for them to run. The officers stormed the warehouse, their guns drawn as they took John and Rick into custody. Marcus stood back, watching as the men who had haunted his past were finally taken away in handcuffs. The lead officer approached Marcus, his expression serious. "We got the call from a woman named Emily," he said. "She said you'd have evidence of criminal activity." Marcus nodded and handed over the recording device. "It's all on there," he said. "Everything you need." The officer took the device, giving Marcus a nod of appreciation. "You did the right thing," he said. "These men have been wanted for years. You just made our job a lot easier." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was finally over. The threat that had loomed over his life for so long had been neutralized, and for the first time in years, he felt free. With John and Rick safely in police custody, Marcus stepped outside the warehouse, breathing in the cold night air. The tension that had gripped him for so long began to ease, replaced by a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. Emily was waiting for him, standing by her car with a worried expression on her face. When she saw him, she rushed over, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marcus nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "I'm okay. It's over." Emily let out a sigh of relief, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank God. I was so worried." Marcus pulled her into a hug, holding her close. "I'm sorry I put you through this," he said softly. "But I couldn't have done it without you." Emily shook her head, pulling back to look at him. "You don't have to apologize. You did what you had to do. And now it's finally over." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of her words. It was over. The men who had once controlled his life were gone, and he was free to live the life he had built for himself, a life that was worth fighting for. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal. The town buzzed with the news of John and Rick's arrest, and Marcus became something of a local hero. People who had once looked at him with suspicion now treated him with respect, grateful for what he had done to keep their community safe. Emily remained a constant presence in his life, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. What had started as a chance encounter in the snow had turned into something much deeper, a friendship built on trust, understanding, and mutual respect. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Marcus found himself thinking more and more about the future. The life he had once feared was now full of possibilities, and for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about what lay ahead. He and Emily spent more time together, exploring the town, sharing stories, and simply enjoying each other's company. It was clear to both of them that their relationship was evolving into something more, but they were in no rush. They had been through enough to know that good things were worth waiting for. One evening, as the sun set over the town, Marcus sat on the porch of his small home, reflecting on how far he had come. The fear and uncertainty that had once defined his life had been replaced by a sense of peace and purpose. He thought back to that fateful day in the snow when he had stopped to help a stranger in need. That simple act of kindness had set off a chain of events that had led him to confront his darkest fears. But it had also given him something far more valuable, a chance at redemption, a chance to start over. Marcus knew that he couldn't change his past, but he could shape his future. And with Emily by his side, he was ready to do just that. As he watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Marcus felt a sense of contentment he hadn't known in years. The darkness that had once overshadowed his life was gone, replaced by a light that grew brighter with each passing day. He smiled, knowing that the future was full of promise, and for the first time in a long time, he was excited to see where it would take him. because now he had something worth living for, something worth fighting for. And that made all the difference. As the seasons changed in Willow Creek, so too did the lives of Marcus and Emily. The winter snow melted away, giving rise to the vibrant colors of spring. The town, once quiet and subdued, now buzzed with new energy. For Marcus, it felt like a metaphor for his own life, the cold, dark past giving way to a brighter, more hopeful future. The garage where Marcus worked became busier as people brought their cars in for post-winter maintenance. He found himself working longer hours, but he didn't mind. The work kept his hands busy and his mind focused, helping to push away the lingering thoughts of John and Rick and the life he'd left behind. Emily had become a constant presence in his life. She would often stop by the garage, bringing him lunch or simply sitting with him as he worked. Their relationship had deepened over the past few months, growing into something neither of them had expected but both cherished deeply. One warm afternoon, as Marcus was bent over the engine of an old pickup truck, he heard the familiar sound of Emily's footsteps approaching. "Hey there, stranger," she called out, a smile in her voice. Marcus straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag as he turned to face her. "Emily," he said, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "What brings you by?" Emily held up a paper bag. "Thought you might be hungry. I brought sandwiches from that new deli in town." Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "You're going to spoil me, you know that." "That's the plan," Emily replied with a wink. They sat together on the worn bench outside the garage, enjoying their lunch and each other's company. As they ate, Marcus couldn't help but marvel at how much his life had changed. A year ago, he had been living in constant fear, always looking over his shoulder. Now, he felt at peace, content in a way he never thought possible. "What are you thinking about?" Emily asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. Marcus smiled, meeting her gaze. "Just how different things are now. How much better." Emily reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You deserve this, Marcus. After everything you've been through, you deserve to be happy." Marcus squeezed her hand, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "We both do," he said softly. As they finished their lunch, Emily's expression grew serious. "There's something I wanted to talk to you about," she said, her voice hesitant. Marcus felt a flicker of concern. "What is it?" Emily took a deep breath. "I got a job offer. It's a great opportunity, but it's in the city, about 2 hours away." Marcus felt his heart sink. The thought of Emily leaving Willow Creek, leaving him, was more painful than he expected. But he forced a smile, knowing he had to be supportive. "That's great, Emily. You should take it." Emily studied his face, her brow furrowed. "I haven't decided yet. It's a big change, and—" She paused, biting her lip. "I don't want to leave you." Marcus felt a surge of emotion at her words. He wanted to tell her to stay, to ask her to choose him over the job. But he knew he couldn't do that. Emily deserved to pursue her dreams, even if it meant leaving Willow Creek behind. "You should take it," he said again, his voice firm. "This is a great opportunity for you. Don't let me hold you back." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "But what about us? What we've built here?" Marcus pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere, Emily. We'll make it work." As they sat there, holding each other, Marcus felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him. He was happy for Emily, proud of her for pursuing her dreams. But he also felt a deep sense of loss. Willow Creek had become his home, his sanctuary. The thought of facing it without Emily by his side was daunting. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, unable to sleep, his mind raced with thoughts of the future. He had spent so long running from his past, trying to build a new life. Now that he had finally found peace, found someone he cared about deeply, it felt like it was all slipping away. He thought about Emily, about the life they could have together. He thought about Willow Creek, the town that had given him a second chance. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to think about his past, not with fear or regret, but with acceptance. As the first light of dawn began to creep through his window, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't run anymore. He couldn't hide from his feelings or his fears. It was time to take a leap of faith. The next morning, Marcus woke early, his mind clear and focused. He had a plan, but he needed help to pull it off. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Hello," came the sleepy voice on the other end. "Mrs. Johnson? It's Marcus. I need a favor." An hour later, Marcus stood in Mrs. Johnson's living room, surrounded by a small group of people. They were the friends he had made in Willow Creek, people who had accepted him, supported him, and helped him build a new life. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I know it's early, but I need your help with something important." As Marcus explained his plan, he saw the faces around him light up with excitement. They were eager to help, to be a part of something special. It warmed his heart to see how much these people cared, how willing they were to go out of their way for him. The day passed in a blur of activity. Marcus worked tirelessly, coordinating with his friends, making calls, and putting everything in place. By the time evening fell, he was exhausted but satisfied. Everything was ready. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over Willow Creek, Marcus made his way to Emily's house. His heart pounded in his chest as he knocked on the door, nervously adjusting his shirt. Emily opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of him. "Marcus? What are you doing here?" Marcus took a deep breath, reaching out to take her hand. "I want to show you something," he said softly. "Will you come with me?" Emily nodded, her curiosity piqued. She followed Marcus as he led her through the streets of Willow Creek, heading towards the outskirts of town. As they walked, Marcus could feel the weight of the small box in his pocket, his nerves growing with each step. Finally, they reached their destination, the old warehouse where Marcus had confronted John and Rick all those months ago. But now it looked completely different. The broken windows had been repaired, the old paint stripped away and replaced with a fresh coat. Fairy lights twinkled around the entrance, casting a warm, inviting glow. Emily gasped, her hand tightening in Marcus's. "What is this?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Marcus smiled, leading her inside. As they stepped through the door, Emily's eyes widened in amazement. The once empty warehouse had been transformed. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with colorful volumes. Comfortable chairs and sofas were scattered throughout the space, creating cozy reading nooks. In the center of the room stood a large desk, a computer perched atop it. "Marcus," Emily breathed, taking it all in. "What is all this?" Marcus turned to face her, his eyes shining with emotion. "It's a library," he said softly. "For the town. And for you." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she looked around the room. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. Marcus took both of her hands in his gaze steady. "I know how much you love books, how passionate you are about literacy and education. When you told me about the job offer, I realized something. You don't have to leave Willow Creek to pursue your dreams. You can make a difference right here." He gestured around the room. "This is your library, Emily. The town has needed one for years, and who better to run it than you? It's not the same as the job in the city, I know, but—" Emily cut him off, throwing her arms around him. "It's perfect," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I can't believe you did all this." Marcus held her close, feeling the warmth of her body against his. "I had help," he admitted. "The whole town pitched in. They all wanted to show you how much you mean to them. How much you mean to me." Emily pulled back, her eyes searching his face. "Marcus," she said softly, "what are you saying?" Marcus took a deep breath, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out the small box, his hands shaking slightly as he opened it to reveal a simple but beautiful ring. "Emily," he said, his voice filled with love and hope. "I know we haven't known each other for very long, but these past few months have been the happiest of my life. You've shown me what it means to truly live, to be open and vulnerable and brave. I don't want to imagine my life without you in it." He dropped to one knee, holding the ring up to her. "Emily," he said, his voice strong and clear, "will you marry me?" Emily's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, the only sound the beating of their hearts. Then, slowly, Emily nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Marcus. I'll marry you." Marcus slipped the ring on her finger, his heart soaring with joy. He stood, pulling Emily into his arms and kissing her deeply. As they held each other, surrounded by the books and the warmth of their new beginning, Marcus felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had faced his past, confronted his fears, and come out stronger. He had found love, found a home, found a purpose. And now, with Emily by his side, he was ready to face whatever the future might hold. As they left the library hand in hand, stepping out into the cool evening air, Marcus looked up at the stars twinkling in the sky. He thought about the long road that had led him here, the twists and turns, the hardships and joys. And he smiled, knowing that the best was yet to come. For in Willow Creek, surrounded by the love of his community and the woman who had captured his heart, Marcus had finally found his happy ending. And it was more beautiful than he ever could have imagined. What would you do if you were in Samuel's shoes, discovering unsettling threats from his past while trying to protect someone you've helped? Would you have confronted the danger with the same resolve, or would you have taken a different approach? If you found this story of bravery, redemption, and the impact of true friendship compelling, please consider subscribing to my channel. I pour my heart into crafting these impactful narratives, and your support means everything to me. Thank you for joining me on this journey.